All right, this screencast is about Unit 2, which is all about interaction among branches of government. So we're going to be focusing on Congress. We're going to be focusing on differences between the House and the Senate. And eventually we'll get to the president and the courts and the bureaucracy. So let's start with the basics. If you go to the actual Constitution itself, let's go ahead and take a look. Right off the bat in Article 1, and I'm sure you all know this, but Congress is established as a bicameral institution. So there's a House and a Senate. Section 2 details the House, and Section 3 details the Senate. And then, of course, as we go further down in Article 1, we get into things like the lawmaking process and rules and powers of Congress, which is a very important one, obviously. So, okay. So let's start with some basics. First of all, the House and Senate are very different by design. The House is the people's house. There's 435 members of the House of Representatives. Don't forget that number was fixed by Congress back in the 1920s, I believe. And so as the country grows, every 10 years, they take a census, and that census determines how the seats are apportioned. And then we can get into gerrymandering and all that stuff, which you may remember all that. All right, so let's talk about some of those differences. This is from your Unit 2 packet, by the way, if you happen to have that, topic 2.1. All right, first of all, in the House and Senate, a lot of differences you need to know, so let's go through them real quick. The House has 435 members. That's a number that was set by Congress in the 1920s. The Senate has 100 members. They serve at large, which means they serve the entire state. The House has localized districts and a 2-year term, and that's as opposed to a 6-year term in the Senate. And by the way, don't forget, in the Senate, only 1/3 of the seats are up for election at any given time, and that's to maintain continuity within the Senate. In the House, because it's a large body, there are strict rules, and you have very strict rules regarding debate, things like that. So if you're in a House committee, the chairman of that committee is going to have a very strong role in directing the debate. Their debates are timed. Members are not allowed to exceed the time. It gets rather raucous sometimes when people get interrupted mid-sentence and are told to stop and they don't want to, and stuff like that. That does not happen in the Senate. The Senate is a much more dignified body. You do not typically interrupt senators when they're speaking during a committee. And don't forget, in the Senate, that flexibility with the rules allows things like the filibuster, which allows you to hold the floor. If you're a senator and you don't like a piece of legislation, you can start talking and talking and talking, and you can read Green Eggs and Ham like Ted Cruz. And nobody can stop you. Nobody can stop the filibuster unless they have what's called a cloture vote. A cloture vote is 3/5 of the senators. That's 60 votes to end a filibuster. Now, a hold is another thing we need to talk about. A hold is when an individual member of the Senate decides they want to stop work on a bill, and a legitimate hold is one where they're doing more information. They want more information on the bill. They're trying to research it more a little bit. But a hold has the same effect as a filibuster. And just like a filibuster, a hold requires a cloture vote to end it. Now, we're going to talk a lot about the cloture vote later when we get into the nuclear option and stuff like that. But just a couple other things comparing the House and Senate. Because the House is so large, the leadership, even though they do have the Speaker of the House, obviously is the kind of the face of the House of Representatives. The real leaders in the House, and this is from an essay all the way back in the 1800s from Woodrow Wilson, it's still true today, the real leaders are the committee chairman. So how do you become a committee chairman? Seniority. So there's a very large dependence on the seniority system in the House, not so much In the Senate, a freshman senator, someone just elected, can have a considerable amount of power right off the bat just because of the nature of the Senate. Probably the most significant difference between the House and the Senate is the fact that the Senate has a very important role constitutionally in confirming the president's appointees. So the president can appoint members of his cabinet. He can appoint members of all the different cabinet level departments, the Department of Justice, the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of the Treasury, Defense Department, on and on and on. Secretary of State, those are all cabinet level positions. But the Senate has to confirm them. And so anytime a new administration comes in, usually they fire all of the previous administration, especially if it's of a different party. And the confirmation process takes several weeks, typically, in a new administration. One area in particular with regard to the confirmation role is that of the role of confirming judges. Now, it is very important to be reminded of this because judges, unlike any other position within our government, judges serve life terms. So a president who is able to appoint lots of judges where they appoint someone of the same ideology as their own, they're going to have an impact far beyond the 4 or 8 years of their presidency, because those judges, particularly if they're named while they're in their 40s or even their 50s, they may have 10, 20, 30, in the case of people like Ginsburg, 40 years of influence on the courts. Well, she's not quite there yet, but pretty close. But anyway, a long time. And that is why Senate confirmation hearings in the Judiciary Committee get very contentious. Which leads me to one other thing I want to talk about, and that is the nuclear option. Going back to the outline for just a minute, the nuclear option is something that's relatively new regarding Senate rules. So let's be clear on what the nuclear option is. The nuclear option is when the Senate changes the rules to allow straight majority confirmation votes. Now, the Constitution is silent on how a confirmation vote takes place and the vote threshold and things like that, so it's a simple majority. But when an individual member of, let's say, the opposite party of the leadership in the Senate doesn't like the nominee of the president, they can issue a hold or they can attempt to filibuster the nomination. And if they do that, it triggers a 60-vote requirement for cloture. And don't forget, cloture is the means by which a filibuster or a hold can be defeated, and it requires 60 votes. But here's the thing about that. Where does the cloture rule come from? Well, it comes from the Senate. Who makes the rules of the Senate? The answer is the Senate. So if the leadership wants to, it's kind of an ironic thing, isn't it? Because you have this rule that says you have 60 votes if anybody basically in the opposite party objects, which is consistent, by the way, with the Madisonian, tyranny of the majority thing, where they don't want the minority voice to be unheard, right? And yet you can change the rules of the Senate just by a simple majority vote. So whoever has the majority can change the rules at any time. Now, here's the problem with that. The nuclear option has been only used since 2013, when the Democrats, out of frustration by Republican, at that time, obstructionism, decided to use it. They changed the rules so that Obama could get judges appointed. Well, now that Trump is president, he's doing the same thing and is appointing judges at a record pace. So while all this other stuff is going on, the real untold story of the Trump administration, he is dramatically reshaping the federal judiciary because of this rule change, because the nuclear option is now standard practice with regard to judicial appointees only. And by the way, that applies also for the Supreme Court. Gorsuch and Kavanaugh were both confirmed without a 60 vote threshold. So let's go back and look at some of the other elements of the outline just to make sure we're covering all of our bases here. The Senate is designed to represent the states equally. House is designed to represent the population. It's kind of a basic thing about popular sovereignty within the House. So it's the people's House, but the Senate represents the states. And don't forget, senators originally were appointed by state legislatures. They were not elected by the people. That was not until the 17th Amendment that changed. Okay, some other things. Different chamber sizes and constituencies influence the formality of debate. We talked about that already. Coalitions in Congress are affected by term length differences. But what it means is that in the House in particular, there tends to be a constant focus on reelection. Because if you don't get reelected, you don't have seniority. And if you don't have seniority, you can't get committee assignments and all that stuff we talked about many times before the pandemic. Okay. And then the other thing we need to talk about is enumerated and implied powers. Now, remember that implied powers has been with us ever since the Supreme Court recognized it in McCulloch versus Maryland. And there's no question that the Constitution permits Congress to use so-called implied powers. But there's also what are called enumerated powers, which are specific grants of power in the Constitution. And if we go to look at the Constitution itself, you'll see a list of them there in Article 1, Section 8. So Congress has the power to tax. They have the power to, by the way, they tax for the general welfare of the United States. So it's a very, very broad power, okay? Tax and spend. So the stimulus that Congress recently passed, unanimously, by the way, without a single recorded vote, $2 trillion without a single recorded vote, that is well within their powers to tax and spend. Okay. So all these enumerated powers are there in Article 1, Section 8. And the catch-all is Clause 18 at the end, to make all laws which will be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. So that's the little detail that you need to know. It's not an unlimited power. It means that laws which are deemed to be necessary and proper, they have to be related to a foregoing power. And as we talked about many, many times, the power to regulate commerce is the most versatile because commerce encompasses almost anything that is bought or sold, which encompasses a tremendous amount of economic activity. So going back to things like the Civil Rights Act, well, how can the government force businesses to be, racially neutral when they're hiring? Well, because it falls within their power under the Commerce Clause. People of different races engage in commercial activity, go to hotels, travel, things like that. If Congress wants to regulate that to prevent discrimination, they can absolutely do so under the Commerce Clause. Now, one other thing to remember going back to the federalism unit is that it's not without limits. The gun-free school zone law in United States versus Lopez was an example of stretching that ability to regulate commerce just a little bit too far. So a conservative court ruling in 1995 placed some limits on Congress's ability, and even laws like I think one of them we talked about, the Violence Against Women Act, was struck down because it was an overreach and did not fall within an understanding of commerce. All right, going back to the outline, one of the most important things Congress does every year is pass a budget, and that is a constitutional requirement. If we go to Article 1, Section 9, it's very clear and unequivocal. No money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law. And what that means very simply is that the budgetary process is identical in terms of how it's done to a regular lawmaking process. In other words, it has to go through the House, various committees in the House, has to go to the Senate, committees in the Senate. They have to come up with an agreement, probably go to a conference committee, and then that has to go to the president to be signed. And in the beginning of 2019, a little over a year ago, we were in a deadlock over the budget. Trump wanted funding for the border wall. Democrats didn't agree, so the budget was put forth, did not have funding. He vetoed it or refused to sign it, and as a result, the government went into a shutdown because he didn't have a budget bill passed as required by the Constitution. All right, let's go back to the review outline and just go through some of this stuff. Talk about committees. Filibuster and cloture are very important. Let's look at some practice questions. A member of the House of Representatives has introduced a bill to raise the minimum wage, but it's been in committee for 36 days and it's unlikely to make it to the floor. Which of the following is the best course of action for a representative to get a vote on the bill? Member of the House. Okay, don't forget cloture applies only to the Senate, so that's not the answer. Placing a hold, something that only can occur in the Senate. Introducing a concurrent resolution, there's your distractor. Filing for a discharge petition, there's going to be your correct answer. And just a quick review on that. A discharge petition is something that members of the House of Representatives can attempt if a member of a committee is forcing a bill, the term is pigeonholing a bill. If a member of a committee is pigeonholing a bill, that means they're deliberately keeping it from being passed. And a discharge petition is something that requires a majority vote. So only the majority party typically is going to be able to pull off a discharge petition. And remember, this is kind of frowned upon because you're kind of insulting the leadership order, because necessarily the person who's the committee chairman is a member of the majority party, and then the majority party leadership is forcing the bill out of their committee, taking it out of their hands, so to speak. So these are kind of things that you remember, kind of questionable whether they're kind of a friendly thing to do. Okay, talked about the budget. Very, very important terminology with regard to Congress is pork barreling and log rolling. Pork barrel spending, pork barrel legislation is money. It can happen both in the House and Senate. What's diverted to a home state. So a big new freeway project is an example here in Houston of pork barrel spending, where we like it, but other people in the country may not see the urgency. Log rolling refers to the idea that members in Congress often coordinate with each other, and even though pork barreling usually has a negative connotation because you're spending other people's money for your home districts, federal dollars, everybody does it. And so it's kind of like mutually assured destruction. Everybody's looking the other way and totally aware that this is going on, but nobody calls each other out. In other words, they're cooperating like the sport of log rolling requires cooperation. Okay, let's look at another practice question. Which of the following scenarios best illustrates a member of Congress supporting pork barrel legislation? A senator from a coal-producing state voting against a job training program for coal miners. B, a member of a House voting for urban renewal in exchange for increased funding for roads. C, a senator from an agricultural state amending legislation to establish a potato research institute in his or her state. I'm going to guess that's Idaho. Or D, a member of the House Armed Services Committee marking up a bill that will increase funding for military bases. Well, the one that's clearly aimed at helping an individual state is C, and it doesn't matter that it's a senator. Senators and representatives engage in pork barreling all the time. All right, next up, we're going to talk about this objective. Explain how congressional behavior is influenced by election processes, partisanship, and divided government. First of all, divided government is the norm in American politics. I've talked about this many, many times. back when we actually used to have class. Divided government simply means that the majority party in the House or the Senate is the opposite party of the president's. And right now we have divided government. We have also divided party control, which means the House and Senate are opposite. During the Obama administration, he had to deal with full-on divided government where the House and the Senate were of the opposite political party of the president. And of course, that makes it very difficult to get anything done. But if you have to pick one and you're the president, you'd rather have the Senate on your side than the House because the Senate has that crucial confirmation role. Okay, I said we'd talk about gerrymandering, so let's do it. Gerrymandering, redistricting, and unequal representation of constituencies have been partially addressed by such court decisions as Baker versus Carr, Shaw versus Reno. Baker versus Carr was an equal protection challenge under the 14th Amendment because what was happening in the state of Tennessee was that the congressional districts were all different sizes. You had these urban districts where everybody was crammed in like sardines, and then you had these rural districts, and they weren't equitable. So you'd have some congressional districts where the ratio was maybe 1 to 1,000 or something like that, and then the urban districts it was 1 in a million or something like that in terms of representation. Of course, that's not fair. So the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment was used by the court to resolve that, and it gave us the one person, one vote doctrine, which means that congressional district boundaries have to be done roughly equally. And that translates, by the way, today, and we'll know after the 2020 census even more, probably going to be one representative for about every 800,000 people, maybe 850,000, because we've had a lot of population growth. Okay, lame duck presidents, that's not a made-up term. A lame duck president is a president in the last year of his presidency, and it's usually referred to in the president's second term if they get reelected. And it's usually the year, maybe 2-year time period where they can't run for reelection. So members of Congress and the nation generally starts focusing on who the next president's going to be. And so it's kind of diminishes their power. And Obama was clearly targeted by Republicans as a lame duck president because they denied him a Supreme Court pick when Scalia died. And their argument was, well, we really need to see who the next president's going to be. And of course, it was a gamble that paid off for the Republicans because they were able to leave that seat open. Because don't forget, the Senate gives the very broad discretion in confirming. And let's go look at the actual language of the Constitution in Article 2. He shall have the power by and with the advice and consent. And it's not just advice or consent, it's and consent. So the Senate is a co-equal participant, and that's how the Republican Party was able to pull that off back in 2016. All right, another very important concept in your understanding of Congress is how members of Congress see themselves. If members of Congress see themselves as a delegate, that means they believe their job is to do as their constituents would want. Constituents are the people represented by the representative. So someone who's acting as a delegate is very conscious of what the mood of the electorate is and only acts in a way that is consistent with what the people want in their district. Whereas somebody who's a trustee, I always say trustee, trust me. It's kind of an elitist view where the member of Congress, maybe they're acting on information that's not known to the people. Maybe they just think they know better than the people or whatever the case may be, but they're making policy, they're voting on policy that they personally agree with, even if their constituents don't. And a politico is just kind of a catch-all. It means kind of mixing it up, doing a little bit of both, which is really what most of them actually do. So let's look at this sample question. Which of the following scenarios is an example of the trustee model of representation? NAACP leadership sends representatives to Washington to lobby for changes to the Voting Rights Act. Congress passes a bill allocating money to clean up nuclear waste site after a wave of large-scale peaceful protests. A member of Congress votes to close a popular tax loophole based on the belief that the money would be better spent paying down the national debt. A presidential candidate advocates using executive orders to increase the minimum wage. Okay, this is kind of a tricky one, but the key is the word popular. Okay, you're going to close a popular loophole. That means the people in the district would want it, but he, the member of Congress, or she, is more concerned about paying down the debt. So they're acting based on their own belief, not based on the belief of their constituents, which is why this one, C, is consistent with the trustee model. Hello?
Hello, is this Mr. Stone?
Yep.
Yes.
Hello?
I understand you're trying to explain some things to your students and they're falling asleep because it's so boring.
Yeah.
And I noticed the last time I called you, the explanation of the AP exam went viral. It has like 150 billion views or something like that on YouTube. I saw it. It was very good. Very good because of me. So I wanted to make sure that your students were not falling asleep. So, Mr. Stone, did you tell them about the Senate? Tell them about the nuclear option?
I did.
I'm a big fan of the nuclear option, personally. It allows me to get people like Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh, great judges. Great judges.
Yep.
They're terrific people. But the Democrats didn't like him. So they had to obstruct. They went to his high school yearbook, Brett Kavanaugh, asked about parties he went to when he was 15 years old. At boarding school or something, I don't know. Did you tell him about the confirmation roll and how the Democrats are always trying to vote down my appointees?
Sort of.
Did you talk about Nancy Pelosi? You know, she tore up my speech right in front of everybody. Did you see it? Can you believe it? She tore up a speech, one of the greatest speeches, and it was like Gettysburg Address. And she tore it up, just tore it up for everybody to see. And you know, she was planning it too. You can see the video. She started tearing it while I was speaking. Very rude. Very rude. Terrible thing. But anyway, and did you talk about the Senate?
I did.
You know, we got a lot of great senators like Mitch McConnell. We got some I don't like so much, but Mitch McConnell is a good guy. You know, I like Mitch McConnell because he understands that we got to have judges that are good judges, that think like I do, that think the Constitution is important.
Yeah.
And we got a lot of judges confirmed. We got a record number of judges confirmed under my administration because Mitch McConnell used the nuclear, and that wasn't his idea. That was Harry Reid. Very bad. Changing the rules, very bad. But I like it because I got a lot of judges.
That's true.
And that means Trump is going to be around for a long time, not just while I'm here as president. But after I'm not president, those judges are going to be there. They say for life, you know. Long time.
Yeah.
People live a lot longer now. They could live to be 130 years old. Can you imagine? Wouldn't that be terrific? 130 years of Trump. And Mr. Stone, I know you're a good guy. You're a smart guy.
Thank you.
Probably talked about all this stuff already.
Most of it.
Did you talk about things like pork barrel spending and how the Democrats are always wasting everybody's money?
Mm-hmm.
I'm just kidding. The Republicans do it too.
Of course.
Did you talk about divided government?
Yes.
Divided, you know, if it wasn't for divided government, we could have built a wall that was 500 feet tall. We could have had it built within a month. Could have made it solid gold. But the Democrats didn't want it. Okay, gotta go. Gotta have another press conference. You notice how I have the press conferences right when the evening news starts? I do that to make them angry. I do that because I know that they gotta watch Trump. Because I'm the president. And I told you I'm a smart guy. If I can't have my rallies because of social distancing, I'll just interrupt the news every day and talk about myself. and talk about how great the country is, even though we have this terrible, terrible virus. But we're going to declare war on the virus. I'm going to implement the full force of the United States military to go after the virus. We're going to launch nuclear missiles at the germs till they're all gone. And then, when the virus is defeated, America will be so great the stock market will reach 500 billion. Everybody's going to be a billionaire. Anyway, all right, gotta go.
Oh, all right. Well, that was the President of the United States once again. All right, students. Hope you're having a good day. We'll see you till the next time.